Welcome back to Citizen One, Exploring Our Urban Future, an urbanNext original podcast series. I'm your host, Douglas Stewart McDaniel, and in this episode of Citizen One, I'm returning to my ancestral grounds of East Tennessee to explore the hidden consciousness of a river, and by extension, of every city built upon the bones of older worlds. This podcast essay traces the evolution of what was, for a long time, considered Stephen Holston's river, and before that, the Cherokee Nvsgi in the Eastern Band dialect, meaning the curved one, and on through centuries of renaming, remapping, and reengineering, until it became the domesticated Tennessee River of the modern TVA era. What begins as personal memoir, Campfires on the Holston, my great-uncle John Alan Maxwell's illustrations of Cherokee hunters and frontiersmen, unfolds into a meditation on how naming, mapping, and building alter not only landscapes, but collective consciousness. The essay reveals that every act of development, from colonial cartography to contemporary megaprojects, is also an act of translation, an attempt to redefine what a place remembers about itself. In a new novel I'm working on, I imagine, beneath Knoxville, Tennessee's polished surface, a river serpent stirring. The buried hydrology and spiritual residue of the downstream Cherokee towns and villages of Sitico, Choteau, and Tanasi, drowned beneath reservoirs of progress. It's not a monster, but the repressed memory of land and water. The river, I write, never signed off on any of these modern politics. In Citizen One terms, the river serpent represents a city's unconscious, the underlayer of memory, grief, and adaptation that powers every visible skyline. Just as smart cities claim to sense and respond through data and networks, ancient places once did so through water, myth, ritual, and transportation. Both are systems of awareness, only some of the interfaces have changed. This episode asks, what do cities forget when they rename their rivers and rearrange their histories? Can infrastructure be an act of amnesia as much as progress? And how do we recover the voice of a place when it's been drowned by its own development? The central thesis, you can do surgery with names or you can commit a neat murder, becomes the moral axis of the discussion. Cities, I would argue, are linguistic organisms. Every boundary, district, and zoning code is a word that can heal or wound the consciousness of the ancestors beneath it and the descendants yet to inherit it. In connecting East Tennessee's drowned valleys to the global arc of urban transformation, the river serpent extends Citizen One's central premise that cities are not merely built environments, but living systems of cognition, layered with myth, memory, and moral consequence. What we choose to call a river, a district, a city, or a nation determines whether we nurture a living system or bury it under another name. The river, like the city, keeps score. So without further ado, let me share with you this podcast essay titled The River Serpent, written and narrated by yours truly, Douglas Stewart McDaniel. I grew up crisscrossing Stephen Holston's river without knowing where it honestly began or ended for more than half a century. To me, it was sleep and flint and fog, a slow green muscle that taught me how to listen. My great-uncle, the 20th century illustrator John Alan Maxwell, kept drawing it the way good elders pray, again and again until the line remembers what the hand forgot. In his studios in Greenwich Village and in Johnson City, Tennessee, John always had figures pinned up, half dissolved into wash. Cherokee hunters moving through leaf shadows, their moccasins whispering against river stones. Frontiersmen crouched in the same reeds, rifles lowered or raised, faces lit by the unsure light of truce or destruction. John had a gift for that moment before contact, when two worlds still believed they might share the same water. He drew canoes sliding past limestone bluffs, traders wrapped in smoke, the deer pausing midstream to study the human noise on the shore. Sometimes he'd sketch the river itself as kind of witness, a long mirrored spine keeping score while the living misunderstood it. I've often camped along those riverbanks he painted, up in Virginia near Abingdon, where the Holston still acts like a mountain child, quick to laughter and flash flood, and again in Tennessee, where it lowers its voice and begins to calculate the valley beneath it. At night, the fog moves in like breath from his old drawings, and I can almost hear John's pencil again, scratching the outlines of people who no longer speak, but still occupy the weather and the soil. Every time I pitch a tent there, I wake to the soft arithmetic of water on stones and think, the river is totaling us up. Hunters, settlers, illustrators, writers, descendants, all added into the same column of current and time. Before the settlers imported their inventory and their memory, the river had older names that pointed at its behavior, not at any one man. The Cherokee called the whole body NUH-skee, the curved one, the great bend. Not a single line, but a living serpent with many moods. It is pronounced NUH-skee in the Eastern Cherokee dialect, or sometimes NUH-skee, depending on cadence and speaker. Even NUH-skee, the curved one, carries an older echo. In the northeastern Iroquoian tongue, the word for river and serpent shared a similar single root, NUH-skee, to twist, to coil, to remember its own bends. French mapmakers heard it as hogohiji or NUH-skee, each syllable drifting farther from the source. And long before the Cherokee settled the southern mountains, that word had already traveled like water downstream, changing form but not meaning, carrying its sound south through the old Iroquoian world until the Cherokee made their home in the curved valleys that would one day be called Tennessee. The eastern head was the clear breath we now call the French Broad, born in high blue haze, mountain laurel, and rhododendron hells. The northern spine was what we call the Holston, carrying bone dust and memory through limestone and pasture. Where they met east of Knoxville, the people called it Tennessee, the meeting place. That junction wasn't where one ended and another began. It was a pulse, a rebirthing point, a reminder that you cannot cut a living thing into names without making it bleed. West of the University of Tennessee campus, still not far from downtown, on the high bend we call Sequoia Hills today, a mound once kept watch over the curve of the NUH-skee. It was only one among many, an earthen vertebrae in the long spine of the river serpent, cultural bones that once gave the valley its posture. From the highlands to the shoals, they rose as gathering grounds and resting places, each vertebrae, where ceremony shaped the current and the living spoke with their dead. The Sequoia Mound stood where the water turned silver at evening, a sentinel raised long before the Maxwell Farm or the ferry roads further west. Developers leveled it for lawns and Tudor, neoclassical, and Georgian facades, but the earth still remembers its alignment. When fog hangs low over Lion's View, you can trace the outline, an old lung of the serpent breathing through suburbia today. But long before, when the maps first arrived wagging their little teeth, surveyors wrote French Broad to distinguish it from the English Broad over the mountains and in South Carolina. Colonial humor disguised as taxonomy. Holston came from Stephen Holston, a long hunter with a cabin and a reputation. For decades, his river didn't stop at Knoxville. On 18th century maps, the Holston kept running west through the overhill towns of Sitico, Choro, Tanasi, and down toward the Hiwassee, sometimes as far as Muscle Shoals, Alabama, as if a single man's name could leash a serpent across 3 states. Only later, when a young republic needed a spine, did Tennessee take the bigger stretch and baptize the whole trunk. The Holston retreated to the headwaters, the French Broad kept its qualifier, and a confluence became an origin myth convenient to a capital dome. That's the political story. Then there's my family connection. Our ancestors' home, the Maxwell Kirby House, sits on a rise overlooking North Shore Drive, a stubborn island in West Knoxville's suburban seas. Built around 1820 by my fourth great-grandfather, William Newton Maxwell, and heavily altered in later years by his son, Robert Alan Maxwell, the house stands today at 8671 North Shore Drive as a relic of that earlier farm era. And long before subdivisions and traffic, the Maxwell farm stretched across some 1,200 acres, meadows, springs, ridgelines, and a ferry across the Holston into Blount County. The place was known locally as Maxwell Spring, and its waters, some say, had been used by Indian travelers long before European settlement. The house itself fronts what was once Lowe's Ferry Road, a lane that led south toward the river to the ferry that carried wagons and livestock into the opposite bank. That ferry route eventually became redundant as bridges and new transport lines shifted cross-river traffic away. Just west of the Maxwell Kirby House stands the old Little Creek Sanitarium, a mid-century institution that once promised fresh air and moral clarity to the convalescent. Founded in the 1940s on what had been part of the original Maxwell acreage, it mixed Seventh-day Adventist wellness, farm labor, and gentle isolation, a rural Appalachian answer to the much larger Lakeshore Hospital. The main building still clings to the hillside, its bricks softened by vines, its windows staring blankly toward the river. And merely a few hundred yards away from the house itself, half buried by encroaching McMansions, lies the Maxwell family's pioneer cemetery. Weather-tilted stones, names half erased by moss and time. Children from the neighborhood said that they could hear water under the graves, the old springs still moving beneath the clay. For a long time, students from Bearden High School would call it the old Indian burial grounds, which could not be farther from the truth. Together, though, the house, the sanitarium, and the cemetery form a strange trinity: home, healing, and afterlife, set above what was once Maxwell Spring and the ferry road down to the Holston. The air there feels older than the suburbs that surround it, carrying the mixed scent of boxwood, wet limestone, and something unspoken that never left when the patients and the ferrymen did. When I draw that house in my mind, I see John's sketches, the Maxwell home nestled in ridges, smoke rising from chimneys, cattle grazing on low hills, the ferry splashing at dusk. The Cherokee passers-by, the long hunters following deer trails, the Maxwell children playing by the spring in the 19th century, all layered into that hill of soil and water. It's not just a relic. In the novel that I am slowly working on, the Maxwell farm may serve as a hinge. When the river was still the Holston and names were still prayers, the farm held 1 foot in the old riverscape and 1 in the incipient city. As maps arrived with their dogged colonial jaws, the Maxwell lands were drawn and redrawn, its fences, its ferry, its springs made into line work on modern surveys. But beneath the ink, Earth still remembers how it lay in the curve of the river. So when the river Serpent stirs under North Shore, when tunnels stretch beneath that hill, when springs still pulse with hidden pressure, this is ground consecrated by many, many generations. The Maxwell Kirby House may be a recent keeper, and Maxwell Spring is an old wound. I stand on its porches in my dreams, listening to old creek songs, trying to read John's margins in the bones of the walls. The river itself never signed off on any of these modern politics, however. In flood, it still remembers the old world and behaves accordingly. Stand at the forks in winter when fog clings low and you can hear the old grammar working under the field notes. The French Broad comes in bright and quick, mood of morning. The Holston slides in heavy, old pocket watch in its vest. They don't cancel each other. They braid and say hello. The water that emerges, what we now call the Tennessee, is not a new river, but a reconciled one, suddenly fluent in two dialects of different ancestors. Then came a new theology, the Tennessee Valley Authority. Concrete rosaries on the Serpent's back, Cherokee Dam on the Holston in 1942, Douglas Dam on the French Broad in 1943, both feeding Fort Loudon Lake and Dam, built in 1943, and drowning the clean geometry of that V-shaped merge. The forks became slack water. Today, mile zero of nearly every river begins at a dam's outflow, like a birth certified by a county clerk. The modern river pretends to start where a turbine says so. I don't mind electricity or innovation and progress. I do mind lying about what it's made of. Reservoirs are kind of a mirror, though warped, reflecting what we choose to bury and what we choose to reveal. Beneath their calm surfaces lie the arithmetic of our many bargains: flooded towns, cemeteries unmoved, fish going blind in warm and stagnant water. The valley learned to live with all of this the way families learn to live with secrets. But every dam creates two rivers, the one that shines for tourists and the one that dreams below it. Beneath those polite pools is the older Knoxville, the Undercity and the Underriver both, where the Cherokee kept a map you couldn't copy to a plat. Sitico, 30 miles downstream in Monroe County, sits drowned now under Tellico Lake, but its breath has not left the room. Long before maps called the water the Tennessee, before even Stephen Holston put his name on the current, it was the NUH-skee, the curved one, the living artery that tied all of these overhill towns together. Sitico rose on its banks as the heart of that serpent, a mound town where fire and governance shared a single circle. The people there built with rhythm instead of stone. Red clay tamped and fired, cedar poles braided with vines, the great council house breathing in time with the river. On certain mornings, the mist still carries the scent of burned cane and the faint percussion of drums long finished. Technically, Sitico was never part of the Holston's main trunk at all. It stood on the southern arm of the NUH-skee, the curved one, the branch we now call the Little Tennessee River. In Cherokee understanding, it was not a lesser river at all, but one of the Serpent's vital limbs, carrying the heartbeat of the overhill towns. By the mid-18th century, traders and surveyors had begun calling the same current the Tennessee River or the Tennessee River, a name that soon appeared on maps while the Cherokee were still living and governing along its banks. For almost a century, two languages held the same water, NUH-skee and Tennessee, each claiming to describe what the other could only approximate. When Tellico Dam closed its gates in 1979, it backed the water up the southern arm and over those Sitico mounds, yoking the Little Tennessee to the engineered chain of TVA lakes. The town's submersion belongs to the politics of infrastructure rather than geography, a sacred reach conscripted into the industrial order. But the NUH-skee doesn't recognize such boundaries. Every tributary is still its own breath. One muscle, perhaps. The serpent feels the pressure wherever it's pinched. Tellico Dam was not the first drowning, just the most polite, perhaps. Bulldozers smoothed the mounds into contour lines. Engineers mapped the new shorelines, and the state called it progress. But the NUH-skee remembers shape, not ownership. Beneath Tellico's still surface, Sitico continues to hum in memory, a submerged architecture of pulse and echo where the fish slip through imagined doorway ruins that once opened to council fires. Again, in this novel I'm writing, that hum travels upriver through the old current lines, vibrating the culverts and tunnels of Knoxville until it finds a hollow under raised streets. That's where the breath settles, in a cavern I call the egg of the serpent, the city's blind lung, the inheritance of every name it's carried. It isn't allegory, it's continuity, geology remembering ceremony. Concrete, runoff, and the wet prayer of old fires gathering again, whispering in the tongue of the NUH-skee, the river that never agreed to change its name. Guarding this place is Akiti, a fictional sister Cherokee village to Sitico, I'm setting along the Holston's last meander east of downtown, between Riverside's Fill and the Waterworks. If Sitico was a capital fire, Akiti is a second hearth, a place where trade ran lightly and stories were stored in the reeds. The old canoe routes up the Nvsgi are still there under the surface, fossil channels that carry sound faster than the water itself. The fish know them. The herons know them. Engineers drilling utilities hit unmapped voids and call it karst. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's history refusing to be poured full of slurry. When I give Knoxville a monster, I give it what it already asked for. A creature born of imbalance, hungry for anything we rename without consent. The river serpent isn't some Appalachian cryptid dropped in from a European bestiary. It condenses out of our own weather, erosion, and conquest. To nest the egg here like a sentinel or a parasite leaves me breathlessly excited as it coils down old service tunnels that were once creeks meandering underneath Chilhowie Park and the zoo and down to the river. On heavy nights, the manhole covers gossip. On very heavy nights, they sing. People say they hear a train when no train is scheduled. I say that's the river serpent testing its old voice against new threats. I keep thinking about the cartographic swagger of those early Western centuries. Holston's River scribbled across the 18th century maps of half a valley, like a man claiming an orchard because he planted one fence post. Then the second swagger, Tennessee, a better flag for legislatures and banknotes. Both names are true and untrue at once. The Holston today ends where it once simply bent its knee to its sibling current. The Tennessee begins at a place the old maps called many things and the older tongues called a pulse. Names are important. They are also scalpels. You can do surgery with them, or you can commit a neat murder. This is supposed to be a love letter, so let me come back to the body. The Holston in Virginia, cold mornings, fog that takes its time, deciding whether to lift. The Holston through Kingsport, tannin and factory ghosts. The Holston sliding into Knoxville, that last deepening breath before the merge. I've slept beside all three. I've watched a great blue heron pull a fish out of dawn like a magician tugging a coin from a child's ear. I've carried out other people's trash because the river, like any elder, will let you disrespect it until the day it doesn't. I stood at the forks and felt the ground under the grass vibrate, thin as a fiddle string, and known the egg was down there somewhere, warm and patient. If you write a city honestly, you have to write the water honestly. You have to let the river keep all its names at once. Nvsgi in the bones, Holston in the mountains, French Broad in the hour before the sun, Tennessee in the long public story. You have to let the drowned town keep speaking through brick and the sister village breathe under Riverside. You have to imagine and let the monster be what it is, a consequence, without pretending it isn't beautiful when it rises slick with mica and fog, all the old fires reflected in its eyes. I'm trying to draw with words the way my uncle did in pen and ink, not just the outline of a thing, but the temperament inside it. The Nvsgi, the Holston, or the Tennessee will outlast me and my books, and whatever new names the next committee votes to stencil on the maps. That's fine. My job is to stand on the banks of the river, listen for the measure, and keep the reckoning honest. The river serpent will total us up. It always does. Thanks for listening to this podcast essay, The River Serpent. I'm your host, Douglas Stewart McDaniel, and this is Citizen One, Exploring Our Urban Future, an urbanNext original podcast series. I really appreciate you listening to this special, much more personal essay and the tradition of the Appalachian storytellers. Thanks for joining me today, and I'll see you again.